Good evening. Welcome to another in our series on the book of Acts. I'd like to begin this evening with a reading of Psalm 56. I was torn between two Psalms, this one and Psalm 61, but this seems to fit better with what we're going to be looking at tonight. Psalm 56. Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me. All day long an attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife. They lurk. They watch my steps, as they have waited for my life. For their crime will they escape? In wrath cast down the peoples, O God. You have kept count of my tossings, put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise. In God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thank offerings to you, for you have delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. So that sort of fits in well with what we're going to be looking at this evening in Acts chapter 23, verses 11 to 35, as we finish out Acts 23. We left, we we went fast last week. I'll say that for the class. We went through the events, the 12 days that Paul spent in Jerusalem. Actually, we did 7 days in Jerusalem. There's 5 more days of the journey out to Caesarea, where Paul is going to be making his defense before Felix, and that period of time elapses the other 5 days. But Paul had been in Jerusalem for a week when a riot was stirred up because he was there. Accusations were levied against Paul, and the furor over it grew so intense that the Roman administrator there, the procurator, the tribune, stepped in and rescued Paul from the mob. Paul tried to make his defense before the people and was doing fine up until the point that he mentioned that God had sent him to the Gentiles, and then the people got all up in arms again, and the tribune takes Paul out of the crowd because they're threatening to tear Paul apart. Following this event, he takes Paul down to the Sanhedrin, and because he's trying to get the straight of what they're accusing Paul of. He's very unclear of what Paul is being charged with by the Jews. Paul notices the makeup of the group there, that some are Sadducees and some are Pharisees. Paul's a Pharisee, and so he calls out to the Pharisees, brothers, I stand before you today accused based on the hope of the resurrection. The Sadducees don't think there's a resurrection. The Pharisees are confident that there is a resurrection. And so the Sanhedrin erupts in a debate over this theological issue that Paul has raised. And again, the tribune has to rescue Paul out of their midst because the discussion turns violent. These men are very agitated over the the statement that Paul made. Some of them are saying, this is heresy, and others are defending Paul, saying he hasn't done anything deserving death. Why are you picking on Paul? And that brought us up to chapter 23, verse 11, which is really the linchpin. It's the verse on which the latter third of Acts balances. The statement that Jesus makes in verse 11, take courage. In other words, don't be afraid. For as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so also you must testify in Rome. And we're going to discuss that verse a little bit more deeply because we didn't touch on it very much last week. But first, I want to read to you the next section. I told you the first section reads like an action movie script. Paul is rescued twice from certain danger. And what we're going to read is that Paul is going to be rescued from certain danger yet again by this Roman tribune. So I'm going to pick up in verse 11 that I just read to you, but I'm going to read it again. Acts 23, verse 11 through Acts 23, verse 35. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. And we are ready to kill him before he comes near." Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand and going aside asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves together by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things." Then he called two of the centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the third hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor." And he wrote a letter to this effect: "Claudius Lysias, to his excellency the governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him." So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive." And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. There's a lot of interesting stuff in this passage that we have a few minutes here to discuss. First, iced tea. Jesus assures Paul. Paul has had an eventful day, the day of his arrest. He's going into the temple. He is participating in the rite of purification. He's been out among the Gentiles, and so he's purifying himself so that he does not defile the temple. He's paying for the 4 brothers who have made Nazirite vows to have their heads shaved. So he's going through this rite of purification when the Jews from Asia, probably Ephesus, who would know Paul by sight, raise a stink saying, "This is the guy who is teaching Jews everywhere to abandon the law of Moses, to abandon Judaism." not to circumcise their children, not to follow the customs of the elders, not to follow the traditions of the rabbis. He's an insurrectionist. He's a heretic against Judaism. And the people get all up in arms. They drag Paul out of the temple. The temple police slam the gates shut. And the word reaches the tribune's ear. Oh no, there's a riot going on. They're about to kill this guy down there outside of the temple. He goes down. He has Paul chained and takes him away from the mob. And we have the mob there that was howling for him, and then Paul makes his defense for them, and they're howling for him again. And then Paul is standing before the Sanhedrin, and he lobs a theological hand grenade into the midst of their council, and they erupt in a furious debate to the point that probably fists are flying, and it's getting physical. And so the tribune has to take him out of that. This poor Roman guy, he doesn't know what's going on. God is at work here. He has no clue that God is using him. And I'm going to read something to you later that states that nobody seems to know that God is using them, which makes me wonder sometimes, do we know when God is using us? Probably not, because God acts in ways that are subtle at times. And so when we are doing a thing that just seems or comes naturally to us, it could be God working through us. There's the verse in, I believe it's in Hebrews, it says, don't forsake hospitality, for people have entertained angels unbeknownst to them in so doing. And I think of the scene of the day of judgment in Matthew 25, when the righteous are standing before the throne, and the king is saying to them, enter you who are blessed of my Father, Matthew 25:31 and following. For I was hungry, you gave me something to eat, thirsty, you gave me a drink, and so on down through the list. And they're puzzled, and they say, well, when did we do this, Lord? When did we serve you? And Jesus says, inasmuch as you did for one of these, the least of my brothers, you did it for me. Again, doing what people do as Christians, living the Christian life, God working through us, all the while we're unaware that God is achieving the ends of some plan through you, through me. He did not bring me in on what he's doing. He didn't sit down with me over the war table with the strategy and the little sticks pushing the figures around on the map saying, okay, I'm going to put you here, and these guys are going to be over there, and you're going to talk to this person, and he's going to talk to those people, and great things are going. No, God doesn't. He does not tell his tools what he is doing with them. And we are the tools. We're simply we're the servants. We're carrying out his will. So Paul has had this eventful day, and Jesus assures him. There's a crisis in verse 10. There's a crisis in verse 12 of Acts chapter 23. Sandwiched between those two crises is this verse where Jesus assures Paul, sets his mind at ease. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also in Rome. Paul testified in Jerusalem, and that testimony was part of Jesus' plan for Paul. How was Paul's testimony received? Not well. Not well at all. The Jews got in a lather over what Paul had to say. That was still part of Jesus' plan. Despite how his testimony was received, Paul was doing what Jesus had put him there to do. Which also tells me that if I try to tell somebody about Jesus and they want nothing to do with it, they don't want to hear, that's still part of Jesus's plan. I don't need to feel that there was a failing on my part. They reject the message. They might reject the messenger too. But that's part of God's plan. So that when the day of judgment comes, no one can stand before God and say, well, nobody ever told me. God would say, no, you didn't listen. You didn't want to listen when others wanted to tell you. You did not pay attention to the things that are obvious when others did not, or when others told you. Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah has had this vision of God seated on his throne and the seraphim saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. And then God speaks from the throne, who will we send? Who can go and speak for us? And Isaiah says, hey, I'm right here. Send me. What shall I say? And part of the message is in verses 9 and 10 of Isaiah 6, go say to this people, keep on hearing, but do not perceive, or do not keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. Jesus, during his ministry, preached to thousands and thousands and thousands of people. At the beginning of Acts, there were about 120 disciples assembled together. Out of all those thousands who had heard his message, we have a group of a dedicated group of about 120 people. Was Jesus' ministry a failure? No. No, Jesus set out to do what his Father had told him to do. You read in the Old Testament when it speaks of the righteous within Israel. You have the nation of Israel, comprised of millions of people, and then within that nation you have the righteous. And they're always referred to as a remnant or a portion, a minority, a small part of. The faithful are a small part of the population of this world, and they're always going to be, which makes the task that we have before us seem quite large and beyond us. And it is beyond us if it were not for God working through us. Bill Moore and I cannot, between the two of us, go and preach to every soul in Albany and save them all, as though by our winning rhetoric and our eloquence, we win people over by the honeyed words that we speak. The power isn't in the messengers, the power is in the message. That does not mean that Bill Moore and I keep silent and say, oh, God's going to reach them. He doesn't need me to reach them. He'll reach them somehow. I can just shut my mouth and go about my business. No, he expects us to speak up as well. So Paul spoke in Jerusalem. He testified to the facts about Jesus in Jerusalem. And Jesus says, so also you must testify about me in Rome. When Paul stands before Caesar, his purpose for standing before Caesar is not to make a defense against any charges that are being brought against him. He's not supposed to stand up there and say, well, the Jews say this, but I say this. No, he's supposed to testify about Jesus. He's supposed to tell Caesar about the risen Christ, the Savior of the world, and try to convince Caesar to repent, to believe in Jesus, to repent, to obey, to be baptized. That's Paul's purpose. You must also testify in Rome. Not save your own neck, because Paul isn't about saving his own neck. He's already said in previous chapters that he's willing to die in Jerusalem. He's not going to die in Jerusalem. He's going to die in Rome. So Jesus gives him this assurance that he will stand before Caesar and witness to the resurrected Jesus before Caesar. Then verse 12, Verses 12 to 15 are interesting because Luke does not mention directly, does not mention that God intervened to save Paul from this plot. There's this plot from the Jews. They bound themselves by oath neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. But God's intervention is implied in verse 11 when Jesus says, "You must also testify in Rome." He's not going to let 40 odd Jews kill Paul and derail his plans. God is a lot more powerful than 40 people, or 400, or 400,000, or any number of people. And it's interesting that the vow here that they make is mentioned 3 times. Luke keeps reminding us these guys have bound themselves by vow, showing how serious they are in their intent to do away with Jesus. In verses 12, 14, and 21, the vow is mentioned. So it's a central piece of the plot here. These Jews are possibly the Jews from Ephesus who had spotted Paul in the temple, and they're really upset that the Roman tribune had taken Paul out of their clutches when they were about to do away with him. So they come up with a contrivance, and they use the Sanhedrin to do it, which kind of makes the Sanhedrin complicit in the whole thing. They bind themselves by this oath, showing their determination. And it's interesting. Do you remember what they were accusing Paul of doing? Speaking against the law, speaking against the temple, having no regard for the law of Moses. These men plot to murder Paul. Anyone remember the 10 Commandments? What's one of the 10 Commandments? Thou shalt not murder. Oh, we're going to murder Paul because Paul doesn't keep the law of Moses. Is it only me, or do you see the irony in that? This is clearly not thought through by these individuals to do away with Paul the lawbreaker by breaking the law that they're accusing him of breaking. So they make a vow to fast until they have accomplished their goal. In 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 28 to 30, King Saul made a vow saying that no man is to eat until they've done away with the army that they're facing. Jonathan had not heard the vow, and nobody had eaten for some time, and people were getting faint from hunger, which is not a really good way to be if you're about to enter into physical armed combat. Jonathan eats a little bit of honey, and his eyes are brightened, and he and his armor bearer go and they slaughter half the army, and the people chase the enemy troops away. But his father is upset and says Jonathan has to be put to death because I made this vow. And the people say, no, that's ridiculous, and they rescue Jonathan out of his hand. But Isaiah chapter 58, verses 3 through 7, God speaks about vows that the people are making, or fasts that the people are holding. He says in Isaiah 58, verse 3, when they're crying out to God, why have we fasted and you don't see it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you take no knowledge of it? Behold, in the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasure. You oppress all your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel and to fight, to hit with a wicked fist. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice be heard on high. Is such the fast that I choose, a day for a person to humble himself? Is it to bow down his head like a reed, to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Will you call this a fast and a day acceptable to the Lord? Listen to what he says in verses 6 and 7. Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of a yoke, and to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. Doesn't that sound a lot like what Jesus was saying in Matthew chapter 25, verse 31 and following? I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. Share your bread with the hungry in verse 7. I was sick. I didn't have a home. You take me in verse 7 here, and you see him naked and you clothe him again. This is what Jesus is talking about, the service that is to be offered. These guys here, though, their fast is a fast of violence. They are not going to eat until they kill Paul. Fasts and vows like this in the Old Testament under Mosaic law are very binding. How many of you think that these 40 men starved themselves to death when they were unable to fulfill their vow? Everybody's shaking their heads. No, because Jewish tradition, the rabbis allowed 4 conditions under which vows could be set aside without bringing a curse upon yourself. In the Mishnah Nedarim, vows of incitement, meaning that I was provoked into making a vow. I was trying to convince Bill Moore of the seriousness of something. He kept not believing me. He made me vow. I had to make a vow to prove to him that I was right about this thing. A vow of exaggeration, a vow that is beyond my means or ability to fulfill. A vow made in error. Oops, I accidentally vowed. That one puzzles me a bit. But the last one is vow that cannot be fulfilled by reason of constraint. It's like if I make a vow to Bill Moore saying, Bill, I vow before God that I will eat dinner with you this Wednesday evening. That's a pretty safe promise to make because we have the Wednesday evening dinner in Devo. I'm planning to be there. Bill is probably planning to be there as well. And so it's a safe vow to make. But I end up in the hospital, let's say. And I'm in the hospital and I'm not released until Thursday morning. I have broken my vow. The Jews would say, you were constrained. It's okay for you to break that vow because you were not able to make that. You were not able to keep the promise that you made. These 4 things seem to cover the waterfront of any number of reasons why you could safely make a vow to somebody and then go back on it, saying, "Oh, it was a vow made in error," or "I was forced to make this vow," or this vow is beyond my means of fulfilling," or "I was prevented from doing so, therefore I am innocent." And so I'm sure these individuals did not keep their vow, and they did so with a clean conscience. Because how can we fulfill the vow? The procurator took Paul away and put him in Herod's Praetorium. That's an armed fortress. We would need an army to go storm that place to kill Paul. Not our fault. Shouldn't have made the vow in the first place. Ecclesiastes talks about making, they all have backup snacks. Ecclesiastes talks about being very careful when you speak, because your words might end up in front of a king, and he will make you pay the vow that you vow with your lips rashly and foolishly. Uh, think before you speak. Probably a good principle that should be mentioned in the Bible somewhere. James-ish, be everyone should be slow to speak and quick to listen, slow to wrath and slow to anger. I think being slow to speak and quick to think would benefit a lot of people. Except politicians, they seem to be exempt. I'm not a political person, though. So, and the plot that they make directly violates the Sanhedrin's own law that pertained to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was to remain neutral, even though they sided with Rome in just about everything. They were to remain neutral. They weren't to get involved in these sort of squabbles like the trial of Jesus that they were involved in that too. And the beating of Peter and John, they were involved in that. Well, they don't have a real good track record of not getting involved, but the law said they shouldn't get involved, and yet here they are involved, indirectly so, in this plot. But the plot gets exposed in verses 16 to 22. Paul's nephew hears about the ambush in verse 16. The son of Paul's sister heard about their ambush. How? Some people read this and they doubt that Paul's nephew could have overheard this plot. And so they discredit this entire story because who's going to tell a small child about their plot? How is this small child going to overhear of this plot? Adults don't tend to pay attention to small children in their midst, or think that they're too immature to understand the grown-up talk that's going on around them. Or maybe, just maybe, God put that child there in a position to overhear this plot and make use of it. In Esther chapter 3, it looks like a 2 in my notes, but I know it's Esther 3, I think. In Esther chapter 2, yes, it is a 2. Is it a 2? Oh, I'm looking at the wrong citation. Yes, it's a 2 down here in my notes. I was looking at something else where it's a 3. Esther 2, verses 19 to 23. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as she had when she was being brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So Mordecai overhears a plot against the king. He just happens to be in the gate where the men are grumbling and talking about it and making their plans. Just happened. In Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, Ruth the Moabitess has come into Bethlehem with Naomi, her mother-in-law, both widowed, and they've settled back in the land because they had left, or Naomi had left with her husband and sons because of a famine. And well, you know the events of Ruth chapter 1. And if you don't read Ruth chapter 1, while I am nattering on so that you get the backstory of this. In Ruth 2, Ruth asks her mother-in-law, can I go and glean in the fields so that we have food to eat? And she says, yes, go, and may you find favor in the field of the man whose field you go into. And we're told it just so happened that the field Ruth came to belonged to Boaz, a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband. It just coincidentally happened. that he was of near kin and could redeem Ruth and perform what the law said by taking Ruth as his wife and raising a son in the name of her dead husband. Just happened to be that way. Nowhere is it said that God put these people there at the right time and in the right place to fulfill his purpose. Ruth becomes the great grandmother of King David. So it's a fairly important thing that she meets Boaz and marries him. God has to work that out somehow. That's not beyond the ability of God. God is not fooled by their plot. He's not unaware of this plot. And so he uses this boy, this young boy, to fulfill his purpose. One of the commentators in this section wrote, saying, each of the players in this drama retains his freedom, and all serve the purpose of God, ignorant though they be of it, except for Paul. Almost nothing is done or spoken by him, and yet he remains the center of everyone's intense actions. And that's a very interesting observation. Paul says one thing, and that's in verse 17. Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him. Those are the only words Paul speaks in this entire section. And yet the entire section is about Paul and about the actions of the Roman tribune to rescue Paul, which I mentioned last week has an awful lot of irony, and the Romans are going to be the ones to bring Paul to Rome so that he can testify. And God is going to use the Romans to protect Paul until he gets to Rome, where he's going to stand before Caesar eventually and be executed. The plot doesn't escape God's notice. None of us can outwit God. Nobody can. God knows everything. He knows the hearts, he knows the thoughts and the intentions of everybody's heart. And so he uses this young boy. This is the first and only time that Paul's family is mentioned anywhere in the New Testament. That Paul has a sister or a nephew. There's a kind of indirect reference to his parents, but we would assume that Paul has parents like everybody else. But here is a mention of a sister and her son, the young child, probably 10 or 12 years old, possibly, in that age range. His sister might be a member of the Jerusalem church, or it might just be that she has familial concern for her brother. And it's not unusual that this young boy can come into the presence of Paul, who is under who is in protective custody by the Romans. He's referred to by the centurion as a prisoner, but he's a privileged prisoner. As a Roman citizen, he has the right to be tended to by family and friends. If you look in Acts chapter 24 and verse 23, verse 22, Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. Then he gave orders to the centurion that he, that is Paul, should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. If you look at the last couple of verses of the book of Acts, Acts 28, verse 30 and 31, last two verses of the book. He lived there for 2 whole years. This is in Rome, under house arrest, at his own expense, and welcomed all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. So Paul has some freedom as a prisoner of the Romans because he's a Roman citizen. They are going to treat him with a certain degree of care and deference. So when his nephew comes to him and says, hey, Uncle Paul, I overheard this plot, and Paul calls a centurion over and says, please take this boy to the tribune. He has something to say to him. The centurion does what Paul says. Our prison guards noted for jumping when a prisoner says, come or go. No, not necessarily. Because we view the prisoner as not having the rights or the authority to order the guards about. Again, Paul is a citizen. He has rights, and the Tribune has given orders about him. The Tribune, they were going to scourge him. Remember, they were going to whip him, and Paul said, "Is it lawful for you to whip a man uncondemned who is a Roman citizen?" And they all drew back in fear. And so Lysias is going to fall all over himself to make certain that Paul gets treated with the deference and the respect due him. And so he sends his nephew to the Tribune, and the centurion in verse 18 says, "Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to bring this young man to you as he has something to say to you." Verse 19 is interesting. The Tribune took him by the hand. This is a gentle action. This man who was going to have Paul whipped. And that shouldn't seem as out of character as it might. Before he knew that Paul was a Roman citizen, he had every inkling that Paul was just a Jewish troublemaker. He said, "You're the Egyptian who led 4,000 men into the desert and caused a big fuss, aren't you?" And so he was going to have Paul beaten on that supposition. When he found out Paul was a citizen, no, hands off. We step back and we reassess and we do things differently. Also, if I am correct, and others who surmise that this is a young boy, you're standing before the commander of 1,000 soldiers in the city of Jerusalem. This is a powerful man. This is a man who can say life, death, and his word is going to be carried out. If I'm a young boy going before this man who I have grown up hearing that he's Attila the Hun, he's this powerful authoritarian figure under whose thumb we're languishing, and if you look at him sideways, he'll order them to chop your head off. He probably will be a little bit scared, a little bit nervous. And so Lysias takes him by the hand, takes him aside, gives him his full attention, and says, "What do you have to tell me?" And I like the accounting here that the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down as though they were going to inquire something about him more closely. They're lying in ambush. They've made this vow. I think it's the NIV that says, "Don't do it." And I can just hear that in a young voice. Don't do it. Don't listen to them. Don't let them do this to you. So Lysias gives him orders and says, "Don't tell anybody that you've told me." And he dismisses him. And then the response, the action that he takes in verses 23 and following. Luke has already shown us that Lysias can be decisive, that he's a man of insight in chapter 21, verses 31 to 36, when he first rescues Paul out of the crowd, and then later in chapter 23, verse 10, when he takes him out of the Sanhedrin during the time of violence there. He's a man who makes decisions. He has learned that Paul is a citizen. He's learned that Paul is being accused for things that do not deserve death. And because he is now in Paul's protective custody, he's responsible for him. He has to keep Paul alive. And so he sends 470 soldiers with Paul to escort him to Caesarea, where Governor Felix resides. In the dead of night, they're going to take him out of the city, get him out of the hands of the Jews. And it's interesting because this gives him the ability to say no to the request to have Paul brought before the Sanhedrin, because Paul's no longer in the city when this request will come to him, without seeming to be aware of the plot or seeming to refuse it. Just, "Oh, sorry, I've already sent him on to Felix," and he sends him with haste. 470 soldiers against 40 conspirators, almost 12 times the number of men. Quite the military advantage. Each of them a trained Roman soldier, each of them armed. This is an overwhelming force. But it's also necessary. A lot of people say, well, why would he do such a thing? Why take almost half his soldiers to escort one man to Caesarea? The road between Jerusalem and Caesarea was known to be a dangerous road, especially at night. Traveling at night is to invite a mugging or invite robbers to come after you. Josephus writes somewhere, and I did write it down here, Antiquities of the Jews. There it is. That robbers were regularly increasing in the countryside and that Felix, the governor, was killing them daily. So in view of the dangers and in view of his responsibility to see to Paul's safety, he sends a troop of sufficient size to guarantee that safety. That Paul will get to Caesarea, he will get to Felix. And so they go out and they do one night's journey, about a third-ish maybe of the way, at which point the infantry, the foot soldiers turn back and come back to Jerusalem, and Paul goes on with the cavalry because Lysias has gotten him out of the immediate reach of these 40 conspirators. If 40 Jews, 40 fanatics set on them, and they're outnumbered 12-1, they probably don't stand a very good chance of harming Paul, especially if Paul is mounted and the cavalry take off with him and leave the foot soldiers to deal with the attackers. So Lysias has thought this through quickly, but very decisively, and sends Paul off. And it's interesting. I wanted to spend the last little bit here looking at this letter. He writes Felix a letter. He has to explain why on earth he sent this man to Felix. And so he writes a letter, very typical of letters in the first century. Starts by identifying who the author is. Verse 26, Claudius Lysias, that's him. Who his recipient is, His Excellency, the Governor Felix, and then sends greetings, and he does so with one word, greetings. And then he goes into telling the story of how he came to send Paul. This man was seized by the Jews, that's true, was about to be killed by them, that's also true, when I came upon him with soldiers and rescued him, that's true, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. But there's an event before he learns that Paul's a Roman citizen. He ordered him to be whipped. He doesn't write that in the letter. Why does he leave that out of the letter, do you think? Because he's a politician too. You don't admit your mistake to the individual who has the authority to punish you for that mistake. No, I knew he was a Roman citizen, so I stepped in to save his skin. Very noble of me to do that. I'll pat myself on the back for that little bit there. My insightfulness and my decisiveness, desiring to know the charge against him, in verse 28, for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. And that's true. I found he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death and imprisonment. Well, yeah, there's the riot that breaks out that he doesn't mention, but we'll just gloss over that. He discerns from it at least enough that he knows that Paul is being accused about matters of Jewish law. And then he writes about the plot. It was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against him. I sent him to you at once. This achieves two things. It gets Paul to the governor who can hear the case. It also gets Paul out of Lysias's hair. And it's the unwritten, no slapbacks, no tapbacks He's your problem now, Felix. You deal with him. He's not my problem. No, I will not take him back. He's yours now to deal with. And so he is solving his immediate problem of, I don't know what to do with these Jews because they're crazy and they're revolting in more ways than one, by sending him, as he should, to Felix. He just does it sooner than he would have otherwise anticipated in order to escape the plot here. But the important thing that's mentioned, and it's it's there in verse 29, is that phrase that Paul was charged with nothing deserving death or punishment, or imprisonment rather. In Acts chapter 25, verse 25, Festus, who's invited King Agrippa in to hear Paul's testimony, says, I found that he has done nothing deserving death. And as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. His assessment, Paul has done nothing deserving death. In Acts chapter 26, verse 30, the king, that is Agrippa, and the governor and Bernice and those who were sitting with them, they rose, and when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, this man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. In other words, twice it's mentioned by the Roman officials, well, 3 times here if you count Lysias is mentioned in the letter. He's done nothing to deserve imprisonment. He's done nothing to deserve death. But he's still our problem. And the king is puzzled. Why on earth would he appeal to Caesar? He could have been set free. The reason being, and Paul will appeal to Caesar in chapter 25 that we'll get to in a couple of weeks, probably. The reason for that is Jesus told Paul, 23:11, you're going to testify in Rome. The most expedient way to get Paul to Rome is to have the Romans take him there and not to send Paul on foot. Send him on the Romans' dime. Make them pay for transporting him and feeding him and caring for him and all of that as he makes his journey there. Because Paul has to stand before Caesar. It's not that Paul has to be set free and can go on his way preaching the gospel where and when he will. But Paul has to go and testify in front of Caesar. And that is one of the main points you can take out of this. That, and also that Luke is, in mentioning these things, Luke is building a set of precedents here that show that Christianity and those who believe in Jesus are not revolutionaries who are threatening Rome, but rather that Christianity is a legitimate branch offshoot from Judaism. And it's a religion having to do with matters of theology and not matters of politics. Christians aren't about overthrowing governments. We're about telling people about Jesus and trying to lead them to belief in Jesus so that they can have their sins taken away and that they can one day stand before God and be welcomed into heaven. But Lysias sends Paul to Felix. I mentioned briefly last week that Claudius Antonius Felix, who is the only Roman governor that I know of, that I think anybody knows of, who had been a former slave, was freed and then was appointed as a governor. He's not part of the Roman aristocracy. He was a cruel and violent man. But he acts properly in accordance with the law when he receives Paul and he reads the letter. And he says, In verse 34, on reading the letter, he asked Paul what province he was from. When he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. That's in accordance with Roman law. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. And we know from the verse I read to you, chapter 24, verse 23, that Paul is kept in custody but has liberty. God puts Paul in a stronghold, in a fortress, and puts him under protective guard by the Romans, who can very easily keep Paul safe from 40 very hungry Jews who are seeking to kill him. God uses the government that's in place there to keep his messenger safe. There's probably a lesson in there somewhere for us that we don't really have time to delve into since our time is up, and this is where I'm going to stop the class this evening. I just find it very interesting that how God is using the people to swiftly move his messenger along and get him where he wants him to be in time for Paul to stand in front of Caesar and give his testimony. It was like when Jesus in Luke 9, verse 51, set his face to go to Jerusalem. God got Jesus to Jerusalem right on time to be crucified. God puts people where they need to be, when they need to be there, in order to do what God has directed them to do or what God is using them to do. And I think that that's true for all of us too. We find ourselves in the right place at the right time, perhaps all unknowing, and we say the right word that somebody needs to hear, and we may never know about it. But it may be the very thing that gets them thinking about God, a seed that is planted and later takes root and grows up into something wonderful, and faith grows from that, simply because God put you where he wanted you, when he wanted you, and used you in the way he wanted you. Food for thought. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording there.